Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alan Barrett, the director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on the public attitudes to disability in Ireland, evidence from experiments. So we really do have a packed hour and 15 minutes ahead of us. In a moment, we'll have some introductory comments from Minister Anne Rabbitte. Then we'll be moving on to a presentation of the report and the results from my colleague Shane Timmins. Then we'll have some discussion amongst a range of people with insights on this area. And then hopefully towards the end, we'll have some time for some Q&A where both the authors and our panelists will be able to take questions from all of you who are attending. So let me say quickly then at the outset, as questions strike you during the event, feel free to enter them into the Q&A function, and later on, as I said in our session, then I'll try and moderate the discussion and pass on those questions to the colleagues who will be engaging in the discussion. So it's great to be able to welcome everybody here today. There's clearly a huge amount of interest in the study, partly based on the number of people who have registered, but again, for those of you who are listening to the radio this morning, you'll have heard good discussion and engagement on the report. And I have to say, as director of the Institute, really proud that this piece of work has been done. I think it's a really important piece of work, some very novel methods used in it as well. So it's a wonderful piece of work, and leading off from that, it's nice for me to have the opportunity to thank our colleagues in the National Disability Authority who have partnered with us in producing this work, and later on you'll be hearing from Aidan Hegarty, who'll talk more about the study. So with that, I am going to hand over the screen now to Minister Anne Rabbitte, who will say a number of words on the study. So have we got the Minister's comments?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by thanking everyone in attendance at today's webinar. It's great to see so many people giving their time to learn about the findings of this important and genuinely groundbreaking research report. I'm delighted to be here to launch this new ESRI report entitled Experimental Tests of Public Support for Disability Policy. This research forms part of the NDA ESRI Partnership Research Programme on the experiences of persons with disabilities across several key policy areas. Societal attitudes can play an important role in shaping outcomes for minorities or disadvantaged groups. Negative attitudes towards disability can be a significant barrier to the full economic and social inclusion of persons with disabilities in Irish society. This manifests in things like additional financial costs, inaccessible housing, or other day-to-day accessibility difficulties. Employers often hold negative attitudes and stereotypes regarding disabled people, which may lead to lost employment opportunities or workplace discrimination. We know from the testimony and the lived experience of persons with disability that negative attitudes towards disability can be experienced on a regular basis. This study by the ESRI into public attitudes to disability makes an invaluable contribution to research in this area. The study shows that the vast majority of Irish people favour policies that support persons with disabilities. However, some individuals do hold negative attitudes to disabled people, which others may not support policies that favour disabled people if these result in trade-offs in other areas. A key finding of the study is that people who have personal contact with disabled people tend not to hold such negative views, meaning that greater social inclusion of persons with a disability is a highly effective means of addressing negative attitudes. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities recognises that discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and the worth of the human person. Ireland ratified the convention in 2018. This means that Ireland has made a commitment to ensure and promote the full realisation of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for persons with disabilities without discrimination of any kind. However, we know that despite the right of disabled people to full social and economic inclusion, many continue to face discrimination on a regular basis. As negative attitudes can result in barriers to social inclusion for disabled people, it's important to fully understand such attitudes and to investigate how these might be changed. Research into attitudes can be an effective means of investigating the cause of prejudice and the discrimination against people with disabilities while informing the decision of policymakers. Previous research carried out by the NDA and the current research show that negative attitudes are less frequently seen amongst people with lived experience of disability or those who have regular contact with persons with disabilities. Therefore, in order to improve attitudes, we need more disabled people in mainstream classrooms, in the workplace, in our shopping centres, attending concerts and sporting events, and in the entertainment and media business. This all means that these environments need to be accessible and inclusive. We also need wider public awareness about disability rights, and I'm pleased to say that my department are working on a national media campaign to increase awareness about UNCRPD. The National Disability Inclusion Strategy, which finished last December, saw a significant increase in government departments and public sector bodies developing disability awareness courses for their staff. There is still more to be done, and a combination of training and contact with disabled people as colleagues and friends will over time improve attitudes. Before I finish, I want to say a special word of thanks to the Disabled Persons Organisations, representative and disabled people who formed the Project Expert Advisory Group. The personal perspective and the lived experience of disability that these individuals brought to the table was invaluable in shaping this research from the outset. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope you enjoy today's event.
So many thanks to Minister Rabbitte for setting us up then for the day. So don't want to waste any time, so I'm not going to make any commentary. I'm going to hand over straight to my colleague Shane Timmons, who's going to take us through the details of the study and the results. So perfect, Shane. I see your slides are sharing successfully there, so over to you.
Great, thanks Alan, and thanks everyone for joining today. Very excited to get to present some of the results from the report. 25 minutes, so I won't get through everything, so we do encourage everyone to take a look at the report. As Alan mentioned, it was commissioned by the National Disability Authority, and the report is co-authored with colleagues Eamon Carroll and Francis McGinnity. So just very quickly, by means of background and motivation, you'd have heard the Minister speak about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 8 specifically speaks to the importance of raising awareness of the capabilities and contributions of persons with disabilities and to combat stereotypes and prejudice. Now, in order to raise awareness and combat prejudice effectively, we need to measure accurately where the public are. So previous work commissioned by the NDA included surveys that investigated public understanding of disability and their attitudes towards disability issues. Over time, there's been a positive trend in attitudes towards disabled people and a decrease in the perception that disabled people are treated fairly. So maybe some increased awareness there of the additional challenges that people with disability face. However, with any survey, there is sometimes a worry about how accurate the results are, particularly when they are surveys of social issues. So concerns can arise if we think maybe people are responding positively just because they think they should. And then a kind of wider issue with how surveys are designed is that maybe people fail to consider the implications of supporting different policies. So for example, maybe they in principle support increasing welfare payments for people with disabilities, but then when the question comes to how that is funded, is support as strong? So these are the types of questions we hope to address in this piece of research. So firstly, I'm going to talk about issues with the accuracy of survey responses. So some people attending today will be aware and will have heard people talk about margins of error with surveys. Your margin of error can be decreased if you spend a lot of time thinking about the question that you're going to ask, and if you increase your sample size. So if you have a lot of people answering your survey, you can get that margin of error down. Bias, on the other hand, is a bit trickier. So where we have a bias, we have a systematic shift away from where the true response should be. So one source of bias is social desirability bias, where survey respondents may want to answer in a certain way because it'll make them look good in terms of what they think others might expect of them. Or they might want to just tell researchers what they want to hear. So if they hear that this is a study about disability issues, maybe they just want to say, okay, these researchers clearly want to see a specific type of attitude, and I'm going to give that sort of response. This is problematic then if it leads us to overestimates of support for policies that help people with disabilities. And this is what led to the NDA commissioning us to carry out this piece of research, because despite that positive trend in attitudes over time, we know from the lived experience of people with disabilities that those positive attitudes are not always faced. So problems can emerge, such as support dwindling when policies are to be enacted, but also we might see that some people exhibit this bias greater than others. So a bit of a spoiler for one of the results we'll see. Some surveys might tell you that people with higher levels of educational attainment, so people who finished university, might hold one type of attitude compared to people who maybe haven't finished university. But this could be kind of driven by an increased tendency to want to respond in a socially desirable way. And that's been shown in previous literature. Okay, so to get on to the main study for this report. So firstly, I'm just going to give an overview of it. We recruited a nationally representative sample of 2,000 people to take part. They were recruited by a market research agency from a panel they hold. The same panel is used to estimate election outcomes and so on, and it tends to be quite accurate. The materials were informed by our Disability Advisory Board, which we are very grateful to, particularly for making sure that the issues that were addressed in this report and a separate paper that's to follow reflected their lived experience. The study was completed online with multiple experimental stages, and that the experimental part really is what sets this report apart from other surveys. So just a very quick overview of the sort of logic behind an experiment. So we take our sample of people, we randomly split them into two groups. One group, in this case, were asked a standard survey question, and the other group, we asked the question in a way that would give them more anonymity. Essentially, we didn't ask them directly about their support for policies. We tried to estimate that in a more indirect way to see, okay, if people have an increased level of anonymity, do they respond differently to surveys? Okay, so the study overview, we have our first stage is the list experiment. So that's what I just described there. And the issues we addressed in that stage related to increased welfare payments, access to housing, and parking in accessible parking spots. There was a second stage of the study where we presented people with short stories. That second stage is not in this report, but it will follow in a paper that's to come. The third stage, then, we included just simple statements about hypothetical policies and included, to some people, trade-offs or potential costs for those policies. I'm going to go through some examples for each of those shortly. I'm going to start with what we did for that list experiment, stage 1, and then go through the results. And then I'll go through what we did for stage 3 and the results. Okay, so to the list experiment. So the list experiment really is where the novelty comes in with this report. So I mentioned that we presented one group of participants. Again, they were selected at random. with questions that got at their support in an indirect way. So the way we did that was by presenting participants with a list of policies, not asking them which ones they supported, but instead how many of them did they support. So you can see the example here. How many of the following do you agree with? The government should do more to address the cost of living prices, raise taxes on meat, hold a referendum on United Ireland, and the final one there, that they should increase welfare payments for disabled people. Obviously, the one we were interested here was this final one on increasing welfare payments for disabled people. We weren't interested in any responses to the first three. So again, people just told us how many of those policies they supported. In order for us to then figure out, okay, how many supported our target policy, we had that second group, the control group, presented with the same policies, just missing our disability policy. So they were just asked about the cost of living crisis, raising taxes on meat, and holding a referendum on United Ireland. So because everything is equal in these two groups, so they were selected at random, we have a large sample, they saw all of the same policies except for our disability policy, we know that any difference in the average response relates to the support for that disability policy. To go one step further with this and sort of best practice when you're using a list experiment, we then asked our control group directly in a standard survey question, do you agree with the following? The government should increase welfare payments for disabled people. So that gives us our estimate of how people usually respond using a standard survey question. This next slide here just gives you this is a screenshot exactly what participants saw. This is our second issue that we dealt with. So below is a list of 4 things that you may or may not agree with. Please select how many you agree with. You don't need to select which ones. And these related to drug use, prioritizing disabled people for social housing, doing more to tackle climate change, and making COVID-19 boosters mandatory. And again, people just said how many of them they agree with. The control group saw these same items just without that the social housing question. Okay, and on to the results. So firstly, we're going to deal with that increased welfare payments for disabled people. I'm going to show you here the percentage of people who endorsed that policy, so who supported that increased welfare payment for disabled people. In the NDA survey back in 2017, 77% of people supported that policy. And that's exactly what we saw when we presented that direct question to people. So using the same sort of standard survey technique, we saw the exact same level of support. With the list method, however, so that method where people don't have to answer directly, we just estimate it, and they have more anonymity in their response, we saw a statistically significant decrease in support for increased welfare payments. So that decrease represents a change in opinion of about 1 in 7. So 1 in 7 people who would otherwise come across as if they supported a policy do not do so when afforded more anonymity using that list technique. Although we can't identify exactly who supports different policies with the list technique, what we can do is look at that same analysis but by different groups. So I mentioned at the beginning that we might see a difference with level of education. So if we look at support for increased welfare payments by those with a degree or above versus those below degree, we see no statistical difference. So it's about 76% of people say yes to that policy to a direct question if they have been educated to degree level or higher, and it's 78% below degree. When we look at the anonymous responses, however, that changes. So we see a statistically significant decrease in support among those educated to degree level or above, whereas there's no difference among those educated below degree level. What's important here, however, is that we observed in this study that there was a correlation between your level of education and your familiarity with disability issues, where people who are educated to degree level or above were more likely to say they know no one with a disability. And this proves to be a more important predictor of your anonymous support. So looking at direct questions, we see very little difference between people who don't know anyone with a disability and people whose parent, child, or partner has a disability. So it's 75% there versus 81%. When asked anonymously, however, we see a large difference in support. So 56% of those who know no one with a disability, when asked anonymously, support increased welfare payments, versus 90% of those who have a partner, child, or parent with a disability. Moving on to the next issue. So this was a hypothetical policy again about prioritizing disabled people for social housing. Again, I'm going to show you the level of support in 2017. Using a standard survey question was 78%. Using our direct question, so again, just that's a straightforward survey question, we found lower support, so 61%. And then interestingly, so what tends to happen in any behavioral science study is you'll get something that you didn't expect. We actually saw higher levels of support for prioritizing disabled people for social housing using that list method. So when given more anonymity, and it's just about statistically significant. So support here for social housing priority is higher when people are given more anonymity. We're not entirely sure what's driving it. Again, it's not something that we expected to see, but we have two theories on it. One of them is that maybe people in surveys don't want to say that they prioritize any group for social housing, but there might be a group then who are willing to say so for people with disabilities when they're given additional anonymity. Or it could be the case that given the limited social housing stock, there may be perceived competition between different stigmatized groups, and that might be what we're picking up there with that kind of counterintuitive finding. And then our last issue was not a policy, but instead a behavior. So we were interested here in the percentage of people who would admit having parked in a disabled spot without a permit. So we do this analysis only on the people who drive. And we compare it to a 2017 question that was just asking how acceptable is it to park in a disabled spot without a permit. So not have you done so, just is it acceptable? So only 2% of people say that it's acceptable to park in a disabled spot without a permit, but 4% of people, when asked directly, say that they have done so. When given greater anonymity, this is 4.8% of people. Now, it's not a statistically significant difference, purely because, or we think because it's a low incidence behavior. We would have needed a sample of about 10,000 to be able to detect it when it's low incident behavior. But despite it being a low incidence behavior, it's much higher than obviously is acceptable, with 1 in 20 here reporting parking in an accessible parking spot without a permit. There are some nuances, of course, with this this particular behavior. We have looked at whether this might be driven by people who know someone with a disability, but maybe they haven't brought the permit with them. But it doesn't seem to have any relationship with your familiarity with disability or reporting that you have a disability yourself. Okay, so that's the results for our the list experiment findings, and now turning to that stage 3, so about policies and their potential trade-offs. So this stage was motivated by a kind of a recognition that survey questions, the best practice usually is to be as simple as possible with the questions you ask. So in psychology, we say that people are cognitive misers. In behavioral economics, we say we're rationally inattentive. Basically, we don't like expending or kind of putting more cognitive effort into something. We don't like thinking about something too hard if we can avoid it. So the quote here, the rule human beings seem to follow is to engage the brain only when all else fails, and usually not even then. So where this is problematic for estimates of policy support is that where they are costly to enact, so if we go back to that example of increasing welfare supports, we might have people supporting the policy in principle, but then when they realize, okay, there's a cost to this policy and it needs to come from either some budget reallocation or a tax increase, then we might see support dwindling. So to get at this, it's a bit more straightforward than the list experiment technique, but we took a fairly standard survey statement that we asked people, do you agree that more should be done to support disabled people in meeting the extra costs of living related to having a disability? That more should be done is kind of that simple survey question that you often see used. Whereas we broke this down where some people saw that more should be done statement, other people saw that more of the government's budget should be allocated to it, and other people saw that a tax increase should be used. in order to achieve that policy. So obviously, with a policy that has costs, you either will need a budget reallocation or a tax increase. And if people are thinking about these when responding to standard surveys, we really shouldn't see, at least one of them shouldn't make a difference to responses. So I'm going to present here the percentage of people who said yes, that more should be done to support the extra cost of living, no, and don't know. So with the control statement, so there was no explicit trade-off or funding mechanism specified, we had 91% of people said yes, more should be done to help disabled people meet the extra cost of living associated with having a disability. When it was to be funded by budget reallocation, this support dropped to 77.5%, with an increase in no responses and an increase in don't know responses. When it was to be funded by a tax increase, we see a further drop, so down to 42%. This is worth flagging as it's the only item in the entire survey where we didn't see majority support for the disability policy. So 42% there when funded by a tax increase. You'll be unsurprised to hear that in most surveys where a tax increase is mentioned, most people say, no, I don't support that. So this 42%, to put it in context, it's around the same level of support that's there for environmental taxes, but maybe not other the social issues that have been asked about. We also asked about support for children with disabilities, that they should get the supports that they needed. Again, with the same setup here. So when there was no explicit trade-off, we had practically universal support for that potential policy. So 98% of people said, yes, I support that. When it was to be funded, however, through budget reallocation, this dropped to 85%. So it's a smaller decrease here, but still statistically significant. And when it's to be funded by a tax increase, again, it dropped further to 63.5%. Again, that varies quite well, though, however, compared to other surveys that have asked people about tax increases on other issues. And then the final item that I'm going to present on today, this related to a question that local councils, so there's a typo there in the slide, but local councils should build more wheelchair accessible infrastructure. In this one, we didn't mention the funding mechanism, but we mentioned a hypothetical trade-off. So when it was just asked, should local councils build more wheelchair accessible infrastructure, 84% of people said yes, with 5% saying no and 11% saying they didn't know. With the trade-offs for this, we included two potential trade-offs. One of them was that parking infrastructure, so existing parking infrastructure, should be removed in order to facilitate it. When we asked that question, support dropped slightly to 77%. And then if we asked some people then that wheelchair accessible infrastructure should be built in place of cycling infrastructure. And we saw a further decrease there to 67%. But again, majority support for each of these. Looking again at one of the best predictors of support across the entire study, it was familiarity with disability. So I'm just going to show you here the percentage of people who supported each of the policies. We're comparing those who know no one who has a disability, those whose partner, child, or parent has a disability, and those who have a disability themselves. So we see across each of the policies, so firstly with the more support for the extra cost of living, that there's higher support compared to those who know no one among those whose partner, child, or parent has a disability, and slightly higher again for those who have a disability themselves. We see the same pattern for more support for children with disabilities, although there's a bit more agreement on that policy. And we see a similar pattern again with building more wheelchair accessible infrastructure. So I appreciate it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the report. We do encourage people to take a look at it, but just to summarize what I've gone through today. So here we had about 1 in 7 are estimated to withdraw their support for increased disability welfare payments when given greater anonymity using in the survey method. Sticking with that issue of welfare, we saw a substantial decline in support for increased disability welfare when costs were made explicit, particularly for taxes. So again, that was the only one where we didn't see majority support. We saw that support for prioritizing disabled people for social housing was actually higher when provided more anonymity. and also that about 1 in 20 drivers admit to parking in a disabled parking spot without a permit. Highlight those from the study again is that majority support for most policies, particularly among those closer to someone with a disability. And what we observed there was that the experimental conditions, so which group you were in, mattered less among those more familiar with disability issues. So the implications here is that support for policies that favour disabled people is generally high in Ireland, but some people may conceal their negative attitudes that they hold. So there's a bit of work to do there. In terms of that work, the findings there about familiarity suggest that greater efforts for inclusion in workplaces and communities, as well as greater awareness of the challenges of having a disability, may help here. So it's correlational evidence that we have at the moment, but there's a lot of international literature supporting this, that increased contact, particularly with someone you are close to, leads to more positive attitudes. So this is where other reports like the cost of disability report that was published not too long ago, emphasizing that the additional cost of having a disability in I think it was 9,000 to 12,000 euro, 9,000 to 12,000 euro a year. So making people who don't know anyone who has a disability more aware of those costs may lead to more positive support here. With this, one of the caveats from the report that I presented today is that we have treated disability as a sort of catch-all term. Obviously, this is not the case. That there are diverse disabilities and situations that will matter. The paper that I mentioned that deals with stage 2 in this report, that gets at the diversity of issues a bit more. So we hope to be able to present on that in a few months' time. Finally, here we see the usefulness of experimental approaches for overcoming some of the limitations with surveys. And just to wrap up, this project is part of a research program with the NDA, so between the ESRI and the NDA. You can find out more about it on the website. But thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Shane. As said at the outset, it's an absolutely fascinating study. And I think you really brought all that out in the presentation and kept time and everything like that. So pretty spectacular job all in all. Okay, so as advertised earlier, we're now going to have a panel discussion. So it's our typical approach now at the Institute when we present the work. Obviously, it's important to get the sort of the research academic perspective, but it's equally important to hear from people who are sort of, closer to the situation, and people, be it sort of from a policy perspective in the area or an actual sort of connection with the issue at hand. So our panel today, firstly, we're going to hear from Adrian Hartney, who's director of the NDA. We also have Niall Brunel, who's a principal officer in the Department of Children Equality, Disability Integration and Youth. And then finally, Jackie Brown, who's a member of the Disability Advisory Committee of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So 3 different perspectives, and I'm very much looking forward to each of those perspectives. So with that, Adrian, can I hand over to you? And are you using slides or just chatting?
Just chatting, Alan. Thanks very much. First of all, just want to really commend yourself and your research team on this very exciting and interesting report. I think we can all agree about how insightful the research is, and it's allowing us to get at that much deeper understanding of public attitudes to disability than conventional surveys typically would. As both Shane and the Minister mentioned, the NDA have done a lot of work on exploring attitudes over the years. And one of the things that struck us when we were reviewing that body of work was the extent to which, when you ask a straightforward question, attitudes seem broadly positive, and then you might ask, well, what's the issue? But we know from all that work that we do to engage with disabled people and their representative organisations that they feel things are quite different from what appears in those data points. So that's why I think this piece of work is really so exciting in trying to uncover that. And I really do want to thank the members of the Project Expert Advisory Group, because their lived experience was key in shaping this research. And I want to say thank you to all of them for making their knowledge and experience available to the ESRI research team, because I think it really did strengthen the research. But I think really, I suppose what it highlights is that although attitudes are still, broadly positive. It's really showing us the extent to which there are still negative attitudes and prejudices and biases out there, which have a very significant impact on the day-to-day lives of disabled people and their families. So as long as these attitudes persist, there will remain challenges then in ensuring that disabled people can fully participate in the socioeconomic life of the community. So research like this is really valuable in showing where to target efforts then for improvement. And I think that's the same across a range of domains in life, be it social participation or education or employment, just among some of them, some of the areas. As you mentioned yourself, Alan, and Shane did too, we have this research partnership with yourselves over the last number of years, and we found that very valuable in allowing us explore a number of interesting pieces of analysis. And I think the behavioural research unit at the ESRI has, obviously done some very, very interesting work, but I think what was really exciting was the ability to move this piece and deliver this report kind of as a first of its kind, if you like. So while some of this exploratory research and this innovative research has been done in relation to other minority groups within Irish society, this is the first time now that it's been done in relation to disability. So it really is, genuinely groundbreaking, and we're very grateful to have access to these sophisticated experimental survey methods. So I suppose I don't want to spend too much time restating what the findings have shown, the persistence of negative attitudes and bias in spite of all our efforts, and how now this is showing consistency with the lived experience of people with disabilities that we've been hearing about. But I think in a year where government will be developing a UNCRPD implementation strategy, it's really showing us how important ongoing work to improve public attitudes will be, and I think it also then shows some areas where people can give first attention to addressing some of those biases in order to improve outcomes for disabled people. So again, I just want to say at this stage, because I know there'll probably be some questions that I'll come back in on later, but to extend our gratitude to the ESRI and to Shane and all his colleagues there. As I say, the expert advisory group members and the other consultees and contributors that led to the research report we have today. And then also just to say thanks to my own team who were the points of contact with the ESRI and worked very collaboratively together throughout the terms of the partnership. So thanks in particular to Rosalind and to David, but there were also a number of others working behind the scenes. And I think we'll all agree that this is a good piece of analysis to have out there for people to draw on.
Great, thanks so much, Aideen, and I'm going to look forward to actually picking up some of the points in the discussion, the broader discussion, in a little while. But now I'm going to go over to you, Niall, if you'd like to make your contribution.
Thanks very much. As Aideen said, we're looking at the successor strategy to the National Disability Inclusion Strategy at the moment. So we are not just hungry, but we have an absolutely voracious appetite for good quality data at the moment. So this report is extremely welcome. I think the first thing to say is just thank you and congratulations to everybody involved in the production of the report, from the NDA to the ESRI, the research team, and to echo thanks to the expert and advisory group as well. I think it's a very, very strong piece of research that certainly helps us. Couple of reflections, and I suppose I'm coming to this from the policymaker perspective. In the first instance, it's heartening to see that even when other factors are taken into consideration, there's still majority support for measures to advance the rights and interests of persons with disabilities, but it's equally valuable to see where things are going, maybe not in the direction that we'd like them to do. A couple of reflections around that. I think broadly, intuitively as a policymaker, the findings make sense, but that's often the case with social research, and then the real value is in quantifying it, looking at the devil in the details in that. And this report is extremely valuable for that. It's not a surprise, I think, to anybody who's been a civil servant like me and has gone through budgetary processes to see that the public appetite for a particular issue maybe doesn't enjoy quite the same level of unqualified support when you start talking about the opportunity cost to that. And that is absolutely a factor, I think, in disability inequality issues more broadly. Every budgetary exercise that government does is a balancing of opportunity costs, and they are difficult decisions. And we're constantly looking to make sure that we are spending limited resources where they will do the most good. So again, this research is really helpful in that perspective. I think, like all other pieces of good research, it gives rise to other questions. It's already been mentioned that people with disabilities are treated somewhat homogenously in this research, but we know from other research that the NDA has done that there are differences in attitudes even to differing disability cohorts, and there's different maybe relative perceptions within what's broadly referred to as people with disability, but with a lot of detail and nuance. And I think it would be really interesting to see further research that signposts to where we have the most work to do in that regard, and maybe where things are in slightly better shape. I think equally it would be really interesting to see further research to hone in on what is it about personal contact that mitigates against more negative attitudes. Is it as you know, could be one explanation that family members or people close to somebody with a disability feel the pinch of the cost of disability, and that's part of it? Is it a basic human empathy thing? I think if you look at some of the equality areas that have made quite significant advancements over the last couple of years, there's definitely an anecdotal sense that actually having a face and a person behind and a story rather than, you know, an amorphous demographic certainly makes a difference in terms of public attitudes, and it would be really interesting to explore that. I think that there are implications for public consultations for other surveys that we do as a department behind this, and there's implications for how accessible we try to make studies. I think there's maybe a little bit of suspicion coming out of this as to some of the standard survey formats that we use in government to try to gauge public attitudes. I think it's useful to have a health warning around that, but it probably leads to other questions around how exactly do we incorporate some of the findings of this report into a business as normal model when we're looking at consultations or we're doing other exercises to try to test the public temperature on something. And we probably need to reflect a little bit on that within the department and in government. I think as well, the report points to the huge value, and this has already been spoken about as well, and no doubt will be further, on participation and meaningful participation, the catchphrase being ordinary lives in ordinary places. That sense of everyday participation in ordinary life in the same way that everybody else has to be such a focus of our work for the next while, and it's helpful to have signposts in that. I think in lots of ways that speaks to a cultural shift as much as it speaks to anything else, and government certainly has a leadership role in that, but it's also broader than any one department and even government more generally. And I think some of our thinking and conversation needs to be what we can do to try to engender a wider societal shift or move the dial a little bit. If anybody's interested, I can maybe talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that are there. I don't use my time at the start to do that classic civil servant thing and defend the record a little bit. So I won't.
No, are you sure? No, we're doing okay on time, so don't censor yourself
okay, yeah,
unnecessarily.
So it was already mentioned that one of the things we're working on is a large national awareness campaign. We have commitments from the National Disability Inclusion Strategy that just ended in 2022 to do a CRPD awareness campaign, and we similarly have a commitment to do an employment-focused awareness campaign that was put out in the Comprehensive Employment Strategy. A couple of things that I think are maybe worth sharing today, even as we go through that. It's become clear to us as we're moving through it that disability awareness is a somewhat awkward term, and it's not the same as disability understanding. And I think you can fall into a trap doing some awareness activities where you just put out a list and go, did you know disabled people have the following challenges? And that's not terribly useful. I'm not certain that it's particularly helpful from the perspective of trying to foster real inclusion or participation. And I'm not certain that it leaves anybody on the receiving end of that message with any degree of greater understanding. So I think maybe the language around awareness is helpful in the convention. Obviously, there's the Article 8 obligation there, and that's significant. But in terms of how we implement that, fostering a better understanding, I think, is actually more the goal than sort of info bombing people. And we're certainly considering that as we put final shape on our own campaigns. There's a couple of other state bodies that are doing similar campaigns. So it's good to see that level of activity across the system, I think. On the employment front, I think it's fair to say that the importance of that can't be understated. And statistically, we know that Ireland is a laggard in that regard in comparison to our European peers. One of the first measures that'll come through on that, and we'll be giving employment quite some focus this year, is next Wednesday, April 26th, Minister O'Gorman will commence the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Amendment Act and the Act of 2015. The Amendment Act in particular has been used as a legislative vehicle to bring forward some measures for broader CRPD compliance, one of them being doubling the minimum percentage of people required to be employed in public sector bodies from 3% to 6%. And we know that there's a mixed landscape there. We have some private sector companies who are very strong on inclusion and participation in the workforce, some not so much. The public sector, there will be a legislative obligation there to up the stakes in that regard, and that's very welcome from our department's perspective, and will be welcomed across the system as well. I think the last thing to say then is with the conclusion of the National Disability Inclusion Strategy in 22, we're giving full focus this year to the development of the successor strategy to that, and that'll also satisfy a programme for government commitment to have a CRPD implementation plan. So since this is the first national framework for disability that will be developed since ratification in 2018, we'll be explicitly taking guidance from the principles and articles in the convention, and look forward to working with stakeholders on that over the course of the coming year. There'll be public consultations, and we'll be reflecting on the findings of this report and the conduct of those consultations when the time comes to roll them out.
Great, thanks so much, Niall. Before handing over to Jackie, can I just remind people, if they do want to put in questions into the Q&A function, we'll get to them in a couple of moments. But with that, over to you, Jackie, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to both the ESRI and the NDA for this study. It's very interesting, and it's an important one because it's in effect the first one on attitudes around disability since Ireland ratified the convention. I think that's also important to note, alongside the fact that the ESRI undertook quite a novel approach to this research. And that's indeed made it interesting for those of us who were involved with you on the expert advisory group. And we are looking forward very much to your phase 2 of the study, with your forthcoming vignettes on drilling down a little bit into the different attitudes maybe towards different disabled groups of disabled people with different kinds of impairments. So just I want to acknowledge that. I think it's really important, notwithstanding the decreasing levels of support with the hidden questions and the list survey approach you undertook, that still in most cases the vast majority of Irish people still are showing and demonstrating positive attitudes towards disabled people in Ireland. And that is the starting point from our point of view as disabled people. The other thing, we think it's really time to move on. For too many years, we've spoken really about disability awareness, disability attitude. We really need to start changing the language. And I'm very pleased to hear you speak a little bit to that, Niall, a few moments ago, around the value or otherwise of just throwing out and spending an awful lot of money on disability awareness kind of campaigns. We think it's time to move on from that, to start speaking about disability rights in line with the UN Convention, and indeed to hopefully which we're all looking forward to, the framework for the implementation of the UN Convention in Ireland. So in that context, we'd like to see real change in terms of attitude towards disabled people, and looking at we would argue very strongly that we'll change attitudes by increasing the participation and the visibility of disabled people in our society, be that in transport, in housing, with access to their extra costs of disability, in the media, in education, employment. There's so many areas of life that we're still not seeing enough visibility of disabled people participating, as you say, ordinary lives in ordinary places. So it's through that action, and the more effort we put into those actions will increase positive attitudes, we strongly believe, towards disabled people as being ordinary members of our society. And we believe that, in fact, an awful lot of accommodations or efforts to increase the visibility and participation of disabled people will also increase the enjoyment of the physical structures of society, and the participation of everyone else. The multiplier effect is greater than just for a population that we have yet to see how many of us, but we're reckoning with the next census data coming out in September on around disability numbers, and we're reckoning we could be looking at up to 18% of the population, maybe even 20% of the population having some form of impairment or disability. So, and don't forget, in Ireland, the population of Ireland is aging. So impairment and disability is also going to increase. It's not going to decrease. So these are all the factors we need to think about in terms of future proofing. So for all those reasons, it's very welcome, this research, but we really need to think about how can we use this research to inform policy going forward. So they will be some of the key points coming from disabled people. And the other thing is, you can do all, I've been involved for more than 35 years in disability awareness training and disability equality training and disability proofing. Some people's attitudes will never change. So we're never going to get 100% or even 90% of the population agreeing with everything. But I think it's really interesting, and I thought it was very useful as part of your study to see the significant differences in some instances around the attitudes of the population when you speak about the apportionment of budget allocation towards a change in policy as versus the a tax increase for individuals. So I think that's something the government should be mindful of, and indeed departments should be mindful of, is how we approach making change to increase equality, how we approach change to increase the visibility of disabled people in our society. So that's really important, that we don't exclude accidentally others by increasing taxes. Maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe we look at existing budgets. Are they being spent effectively? Are they being spent efficiently? Can we reallocate even some of the existing resources that are already out there being afforded to disability services, etc.? So I think we need to interrogate what's currently happening too, as well, alongside the attitudes. So they will be some of my opening remarks from a disability perspective and a lived experience perspective. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. We very much appreciate that. So we're going to open the discussion now somewhat, and I'm going to invite back in Shane, and co-authors Fran McGinnity and Eamon Carroll, I think, are going to join us as well. Again, just to remind people, if you want to submit questions through the Q&A function, that would be very, very valuable. And I should go straight to the questions, but there is a question I really do want to ask myself, if I might, and I'm going to direct it somewhere maybe between Shane and Aideen. But one of the things I love about our research programs generally, and specifically in regard to this one with the NDA, is it's fascinating to see our knowledge sort of building up as we do more and more studies. And in reading the study today, I was very conscious of an earlier study where we looked at the labour market experiences of people with disabilities. And I think this is a point, Aideen, that you have touched on, and you may as well, Shane, but we're sort of seeing this, generally positive view, but yet we know the lived experience seems to be quite different. And I'm just wondering, Shane, partly to you, has anybody, or would it even be possible to do this sort of study where you're not just looking at a representative sample of the population, but you're kind of looking at decision makers. Okay, so I'm thinking about, you know, employers or people with, you know, hiring responsibilities or whatever. And I mean, so there's a sort of a methods question to you, Shane, and an existing literature. And then to you, Aideen, I suppose the question is, you know, is it the case that the general population is quite favorable, but when you move into the sort of the decision-making group, be it at a policy level or an employment level or elsewhere, that the same level of positivity doesn't maybe transfer? So I limit myself to one question before I start taking them from the Q&A function. But Shane, do you want to have a quick response?
I'm happy to kick off there. So that is something that we had considered as part of this. So one thing actually to acknowledge first from the NDA side is that in the behavioral research unit in particular now, Eamon and Fran are in different teams, and this is a collaboration, but usually when we try to use these more kind of innovative methods, we have a bit of work to do to try to convince the funder to kind of take these on board, because it's something that maybe they're not familiar with. Whereas in this project, it was actually the opposite way around. The NDA came to us saying, we've heard about this technique, we've seen it. Is this something that you'd be able to employ? Which was exciting from our side. But on the issue of the kind of going with decision makers, one of the challenges with running a list experiment is the size of the sample that's required. So in this case, we needed to have 2,000 people to answer it in order to be able to reliably detect the effects of the list. So we would need very, very large samples of employers and hiring managers and so on to do that. That said, there are other techniques that might be able to be exploited in the future. So, for example, the vignette study that we've mentioned a bit about, that's going to come out in a few weeks, that uses experiments, but uses kind of short stories or kind of hypothetical situations to try to get at it. So there are other techniques that that could be exploited, I think, to try to get at perhaps those biases on the side of decision makers.
Okay, and thanks for that, Aideen.
Thanks very much, Alan. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. But I suppose the idea of the general population being somewhat different to decision makers, I suppose lots of the general population are decision makers in, you know, various domains of their lives, and I suppose driving improved recognition of rights and the challenges for disability is important then for everybody in that regard. I was very interested in the analysis within the study that showed the trade-offs, or when people were asked to consider, you know, budget reallocation and tax, and but also on the accessible parking side of things, you know, and how the support declined rapidly when you talked about taking away cycling infrastructure. And I think there's often a tendency when prioritizing allocation of budget or deciding on policy interventions, where one group of society gets pitted against another. And I don't think that's, you know, kind of very helpful. And this research is doing a little bit to uncover that, but then that also then points to where, you know, policymakers may need to work a bit harder to bring all the different stakeholder groups along with them then when designing particular interventions and looking at it. And I think then as well, the close contact side of things is really important here, because if we have increased participation of people with disabilities, then they're in employment, they're in the places of work, and then employers are probably more likely to make some decisions, hopefully, that would be disability proofed from the outset, because it's something they're familiar with. And similarly, increasing the participation of people with disabilities within government departments, whereas these decisions are being made, and as government representatives, political representatives themselves. I think all of those steps are important in terms of addressing some of this challenge that the research has highlighted to such good effect.
Thanks for that. Now, listen, I better, rather than hogging the questions, I'm going to go to the Q&A function. So let me start taking them. It's probably simplest if I just read some of these rather than trying to give a summary. So first question from Nicola Meikle. And the question runs as follows. Can more positive representation in the media address the issue of people not knowing any disabled people? A lot of stories featuring disabled people highlight their personal story struggle in order to get a service they need. So about media representations of people with disability. So I don't know, Jackie, is that something you would like to, I think you touched on some of those issues in your opening remarks, but would you like to just take another minute or two to reflect in the context of the question?
Yeah, no problem. I think, yeah, we need an awful lot more media representation of disabled people, just in ordinary everyday media spaces. What we don't want are the sob stories all the time, because that's when disabled people tend to be on news items or on programs. To the sob story, just as Nicola mentioned herself in her question, was looking for a service or highlighting an issue that they've faced at a personal level. But we need to see more disabled people sitting on the panels of programs like Late Debate, Prime Time, other media news channels. We need to see disabled people in the arts, a lot more. We are beginning to see more participation by disabled people in the arts. And look at the success we've had with, for example, An Irish Goodbye, even in the recent Oscars, with a leading actor being a disabled person. And they're celebrated for their acting, not for their disability. So I think we need to celebrate and you highlight the positive contribution that there are loads of disabled people who are researchers. They should be on talking about research they're involved in. Loads of disabled people working in the public service work, so we have so many people. We've loads of disabled lawyers in this country. I'm only just plucking things, that I know of and that people that I work with and at meetings with every other day. So yes, and it's only true, and that's what increases and leads to increased levels of understanding. We need to move beyond awareness. The days of art competitions and nice storyboards and everything else and lovely slides and spending ferocious amounts of money on disability awareness training, that's gone. It's old task. We need to be looking at rights and equality now.
Very good. Fran, I see you had your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Yes, it was just to link to the report and echo that point that Jackie was making, that the more people are included, even in ordinary places, in workplaces and communities, then the more people will see that, even if they themselves don't have a close relative with a disability maybe, but they will see, they're in my job, they're volunteering. So then that will increase the understanding. So actually the inclusion will have a sort of positive feedback effect.
Great, very good. Let me move on to the Fiona Weldon has a point. I think it's more a point rather than a comment rather than a question. And Fiona's making reference to the fact that I think the term she's using is disability equality training as opposed to disability awareness is something that should be highlighted. So I think again, Niall, that was sort of something that you were touching on. So let me go to the next question. This is from Christabel Feeney. And Christabel, again, I'll have to say a few lines long, so I better just read it. It's a really interesting point about the need for disability understanding as opposed to disability awareness. There is a clear knowledge gap, especially amongst employer community. It has also been stated in multiple strategies that all government departments will receive disability awareness training. Will this still happen, or is there a view to amending that agenda? So is that one for you again, Niall? Again, I know you've sort of touched on it, but I mean, I have to confess, this isn't an area I had been aware of, so the sort of these distinctions between disability awareness training, versus other forms of awareness. So do you want to just comment on that again?
Yeah, it's a good question from Christabel. In terms of the second part of it, the most recent strategy, the National Disability Inclusion Strategy, had a similar commitment for disability awareness across departments. And when the strategy closed, most, if not all, departments had done disability awareness training themselves. I think the issue is that there wasn't a standard approach taken across departments. It was done organisation by organisation, and there probably is a value in looking at something to be rolled out more centrally. As far as I'm aware, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who hold the overall HR function for the civil service, is looking at that in the context of broader EDI training. And I agree completely with what Christabel is saying in relation to employers there as well. Christabel is coming from an organisation that does a lot of good work in trying to address that exact issue.
Okay, let me run through now. This is from Flocta Phelan from DFI. So this is again a slightly long comment, so it might take me a minute to read this one out. So again, if everybody can stay with me. So Flocta is a very interesting research. A statistic I often come back to and use in my policy and advocacy work is the findings of the Citizens Assembly on gender equality in 2021, which made very strong recommendations on increasing social protection in support, including for disabled people. This obviously not completely comparable with the questions asked in this research, but it's striking that members of the Citizens Assembly, that was, after the deliberations and hearings, were asked about willingness to pay tax to cover the recommendations. And 95.6% of citizens indicated that if necessary, we are also prepared to support and pay higher taxes based on the principle of ability to pay to make a reality of our recommendations. This is a much higher rate than in this survey, and any thoughts on that would be welcome. So there's a lot there. And again, I don't know, Shane, if that's something you'd like to, but I mean, I do remember the Citizens Assembly on gender equality, and a lot of sort of cynics would have said, oh yeah, people are great for saying that they're supportive of all sorts of things until they're actually confronted with the bill. That was an example where a group of people, even when they were confronted with the bill, said, yes, no, we are still happy to do this. So I don't know, your comments, is that a reliable figure?
Yeah, to be honest, that's the kind of comment that, yeah, I think it speaks to some of the thoughts we've had about citizens' assemblies more generally, that idea of deliberative democracy tends to lead to people being much more extreme in their views than surveys would lead you to believe. I think the gender equality point is a good one, particularly on a tax question. So really, I think that trade-offs part of the experiment that we had, it's kind of a very, very simplified version of that, where when you just introduce one thing that maybe people aren't thinking about when answering a standard survey, it can alter their responses. Whereas in the citizens' assemblies, they're getting much more of the, I guess, richer implications of these policies. And you see that kind of is leading to much stronger support. So one of the kind of challenges then is, how do we make those deliberative democracies more, how do we facilitate them? How do we get them out to kind of people en masse, rather than those sort of 100 people in a room for quite a long period of time? So yeah, trying to bridge the gap there, I think, is something that would be very interested in. But yeah, very, very good point, I think.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Eamon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think a lot of maybe the Citizens' Assembly effect comes down to that kind of contact with or familiarity with the issues, and the kind of the more people know about the issue, maybe the more supportive they tend to be of policies. So I think it's interesting in that, you know, presumably their personal contact or relationships with disabled people didn't increase, so it was presumably coming from increased knowledge and awareness and a greater understanding of the issues. So I think that will be quite heartening in terms of what you can do by increasing that awareness and the familiarity people have, that it can lead to effective support that's resilient even in the face of a tax increase.
Yeah, interesting. Just as we're on this point of disability awareness, I'd like to ask you this, Aideen, and let me come at it in the following way. One of the things that sort of has come to my attention recently, so traditionally I think people talk about disability awareness, and it's sort of people with visible disabilities and how people react. But I think we're becoming increasingly aware that there's a group of people with disabilities that are actually not visible. And so it's a different sort of form of awareness. And I'm just wondering, is this an area that the NDA has been giving sort of much attention, and is it a sort of a growing area? And if I could just give the context where it really came across my own desk is through a staff survey in the ESRI. We discovered a group of people declaring disabilities which were in no way obvious, you know, previously, and that's where it came to our attention in that way. But is that something the NDA have been sort of thinking about, and you know, what's the state of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we're very familiar with. As you say, the fact that some disabilities are not visible, and therefore, you get employers saying we have nobody with a disability working for us, and it could be that they actually have quite a number of people working for them who haven't felt comfortable sharing their disability status, and also then. Even there's public perceptions, but even sometimes where people focus more on a physical disability than not. The challenge, I suppose, in disaggregating that and understanding that is, to a greater extent, is in that some of these survey instruments, the sample sizes are so small that you can't break it down by disability type without running into challenges in terms of identifying people who've participated. But I think it is something that we would very much like to get under the hood of more. And there's a good few ways of looking at it. I think that's somewhere probably where your own BRU might be helpful. Your behavioural research unit could even be of assistance in guiding. But that kind of a sense of hierarchy within disability can sometimes come to the fore. And it's even something we came across in our own previous attitude surveys, where attitudes would be broadly positive, but then if you started breaking it down by disability type, for example, there would be the least positive attitudes would be for people with mental health difficulties, for example, and they would be, I suppose, on the less visible end of things. So it is showing where there are gaps or lacks of understanding and where more could be focused. But I can see Fran is dying to get in here.
Okay, Fran, you want to contribute?
Hi there, thanks, Irene. I just wanted to, Shane flagged this already, but there is a sort of other part to this study where we were able to look at that a bit more using vignettes and testing this idea of different types of disability, from autism, speech and language disorder, spinal disorder, anxiety disorder, in a range of different social situations. And we did indeed, I mean, I'm not going to give a spoiler for the findings, but we certainly did find different responses depending on the nature of the disability. But just a small point on this idea of hidden disabilities. The recent transport campaign on, a hidden disabilities badge, I think, is starting to make people think a little bit more about the fact that there are hidden disabilities out there. Don't know if people are aware of that.
Thanks for that, Fran. Now, unfortunately, time is beginning to run against us a little bit. So I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions and comments that are being raised, but I do want to note one from Christopher Feeney again, and it says, really great point by Jackie, and I just love the sentence that follows: people with disability should be included in all conversations, not just conversations about disability, and I think that is a pretty key point really in all this. Shane, you had asked me earlier if you could just have the floor for 30 seconds or so. So I'm going to yield, as they'd say in a parliamentary context.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. No, just to say again, thanks to the NDA for their engagement on it. So yeah, as I said, it was exciting for an organisation to come with us to say, can you use this innovative technique to get at an issue in our area? And then specific officers, so David and Roz, who Aideen mentioned, as well as just staff more generally, for looking over the kind of materials that we were using. It was super helpful for this project in particular. This is the kind of thing that I usually say at the end, but I kind of switched off once I got through the implications on the presentation. But yeah, thanks to everyone there who was involved.
And thanks for that, Shane. Jackie, you want to come in one more time? I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to leave people with a thought, and the very important thought that we must always remember that the human rights of disabled people who have impairments, not disorders, are already identified and very clearly set out in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ireland is ratified that convention, and as far as disabled people are concerned, our rights are not conditional on attitudes, awareness or understanding, but rather we need the commitment and necessary changes in government and public policy and practice to enable the full inclusion and participation of disabled people in our society.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. Anyway, that actually sounds like a very good way, I think, to wrap up our deliberation. So let me just once again congratulate and thank the ESRI colleagues for the work and for the engagement today. Thanks also then to the NDA colleagues for working with us on this, funding it, but also it's not just the funding, it's the engagement, the conversations around the work and sort of embracing the work and thinking about it and discussing it. It's been fantastic all in all. So sincere thanks to the NDA. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and a special thanks of course to our interpreters. I'm embarrassed to say that the ESRI we have not always had sign language interpretation in the way that we should, but of course we have responsibilities here too, and we'll have to make sure that we improve our engagement. So sincere thanks to the interpreters for assisting today. So with that, I think we've had a great afternoon, and just bid you a good rest of the afternoon and evening. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.